Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. As usual, I am joined today by my perspicacious co-host, Dr. Tommy Wood. Hello, Tommy.
Hello.
Have we used that one before?
No, definitely not.
I know I haven't.
Everybody's reaching for their dictionary right now.
Yeah, yeah. I use it every day, but I know. No. All right. Well, we have a question today from Annika, who lives in Washington, where Tommy also resides. And she asks, I have two bright young adult kids with very slow processing speed. We have been told that processing speed cannot be increased. Do you think this is true? Are there strategies that might help? So, Tommy's going to take the first stab at Annika's question. Tell me, what do you think? Processing speed? Is it something that is modifiable in any way?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and I think there are a few different parts to how processing speed is assessed and how that relates to what might be done in adults or kids, and how those things sort of overlap, like what we can take from one set of data and apply to this scenario, and a lot of that is unknown. But I think we can kind of make some suggestions about what this might look like. So I'll admit that the initial phrasing, they obviously it sounds like there's been some kind of formal diagnosis here, some kind of formal cognitive assessment that says that Annika's children have very slow or slow processing speed. Um, to kind of better understand what this might look like, um, it's generally talked about in children, but this may have been something that was assessed or diagnosed years ago, and they've just sort of been continuing on as you'd expect.
Mhm.
And so, slow processing speed is not a learning disability in its own right, but does often um, cluster with other types of neurodivergence. We don't know whether this is the case for Annika's children, but often it might cluster with dyslexia, autism, ADHD, and then other dyslexia type um, sort of scenarios like dysgraphia or dyscalculia. So like not being able to like difficulty writing, difficulty sort of with calculations or like mathematics. So a lot of these things kind of come together, and slow processing speed may be part of that. But then it also depends on how you're testing processing speed. And in general, there are some subsets of cognitive function tests that are done again in kids, but you would apply them. There are similar things in adults. So the WISC is a standard like IQ test or cognitive function test or battery of cognitive function tests that's done in children. And there's like a symbol search test where you're shown some symbols. You then have to see whether or not they're in a sort of a grouping of other symbols, and you have to do that very quickly. So like that's one example. In other cognitive function batteries, there's things like a rapid naming test. So you're just shown things, and you have to say what they are, and you have to do as many as you can in a short period of time. Um, so there's usually some aspect of visual processing that's done in these tests, and you might do something similar in adults. So I will talk later about some studies that we've done looking at a test called the digit symbol substitution test, which is done in adults, and it's something very similar. So you have some symbols. Each symbol has a number assigned to it, and then you have a whole bunch of boxes to fill in. And there's a number on the box, and you have to write in the symbol that corresponds to that number. And there's usually sort of 8 or 9 symbols, and you essentially, if you want to do them very quickly, you have to start memorizing them in order to write them down quickly, because you have to do like more than one a second to sort of get a perfect score. So you have to move quite quickly. So this, what might slow processing speed look like in an adolescent or an adult? If you're in school, it might be struggling with lectures, struggling with listening and writing notes at the same time, like not joining in on conversations or discussions or missing nuances because you're still sort of processing what's been said earlier. Poor time management skills, sometimes poor like long-term and project managing skills. Like sometimes people assume that the individual is lazy or not paying attention, but they're really just, processing things at a different speed. Again, I have no idea which of these are relevant to this scenario, but this is kind of like what the picture of slow processing speed might look like. Um, then the question is there anything we could do about slow processing speed? There's I found a Mayo Clinic article that says yes, you can do some things about processing speed. I imagine that Annika has already found this article. The four things they mention are reading, so as a form of training the brain, then other types of brain training. So you can do, online tasks with different sort of training programs that involve these processes, having to quickly identify objects or, any of that, something that requires you to process information quickly under a time limit, and then you can get better at that over time. And then it also mentions the importance of sleep and a good diet, although they were vague about what that means, as people usually are. Um, so so there's some evidence that maybe there's something that could be done about very slow processing speed. And one thing that I didn't really see anywhere listed specifically, but which is worth considering, and maybe you have some thoughts on this, Josh, is that if there is an overlap between very slow processing speed and an inattentive type ADHD, then medication may be beneficial. And we know that in people with ADHD, the right type of stimulant medication can help improve network coherence and processing. So, if that's part of the diagnosis, then medication should be considered at least. So, to kind of think about processing speed and what might be done, when you look at the literature, there doesn't seem to be a ton in younger individuals. So this is probably where some of that idea came from, and Annika's been told that there's nothing that could be done. Maybe just because a lot of studies haven't been done, or I certainly couldn't find very much. So I've kind of had to step into the theoretical here slightly, but assume that processing speed at its most basic at least requires some element of maximizing the function of the neural substrate. So like, how do we maximally support the neurons and all the other cell types in the brain to do the jobs that they're trying to do? When you look at processing speed in adults, and most of it's done in sort of 60, adults, maybe 55 or 60 years or older, those are certainly where we can get access to those kinds of data. And I've published some papers on that, or one paper, and we're working on another. We can look at processing speed using the digit symbol substitution test. So like I said, it was very similar to maybe some of the tests that are done to diagnose slow processing speed in kids. And we can kind of see what aspects of lifestyle and the environment relate to processing speed that are modifiable. Again, this is not like we've done a randomized controlled trial or anything like that, but I think they all kinds of make sense in terms of what helps to support processing speed. And this is in older adults, but it would make sense that some of these same issues, if they are relevant to the individual who's younger, that they could be potentially acted upon. So in the first paper that we published looking at digit symbol substitution tests, this was using data from NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is older adults, so 60 years or older. And we were particularly interested in the effects of physical activity and say body composition, but primarily strength. And we've talked about this paper on the podcast before. But things that we found that were related to processing speed were physical activity levels. So just like daily amount of physical activity, whether somebody did vigorous exercise. So we know that, and we're increasingly seeing that very intense exercise and the production of, particularly that includes the production of lactate, drives the production of factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So there's kind of an element of greater trophic support or growth and health support of the brain with intense exercise. Um, One of the factors that we found was that just being strong relative to your body size, whatever that is important. So some kind of strength training as well as maybe some aerobic training and higher intensity training. So all of the kind of exercise that we talked about before, all of that seems to be associated with better processing speed. Elements of inflammation that you can see on a blood test, so higher ferritin, higher CRP, that was associated with slower processing speed, worse metabolic health. And this is less relevant usually in kids, although our kids' metabolic health does seem to be declining a little bit in the population overall. But particularly a higher HbA1c, so worse blood sugar control, and higher blood pressure were associated with lower processing speed. And both of these relate to how is the brain getting its energy, and how well and probably the health of the vascular system, the blood vessels supplying the brain. And then other aspects of nutrient status, so being anemic or some evidence of low iron, having low vitamin D, having high homocysteine, so that's low B vitamins. All of these seemed to be related to a slower processing speed. And we know that these nutrients are just critical for the overall function of the brain. And even though they weren't in this data set, I think we can probably expand this out to some of the other nutrients we talked about. Magnesium is really important. Omega-3 fatty acids are really important. So just like assessing nutrient status and addressing anything there is probably going to be an important kind of baseline. In a follow-up study that we're doing right now with a slightly different approach, but using data from a different wave of NHANES now, 2011 to 2014, but again, in similar older adults, we're particularly focusing on what are the modifiable factors associated with processing speed. And we started to do this paper before we got this question, but it just seems sort of serendipitous. So this isn't published yet. We'll go through all of that in the next sort of year or so. But if we look at the modifiable factors, we've adjusted for things like sex and socioeconomic factors because those are actually the best predictors of processing speed, and we have to take that into account. But for the modifiable things, our number one was grip strength. So some element of physical function is obviously, again, related to processing speed. The next was hemoglobin. So that's sort of related to iron status, like I mentioned. And then we start to see the same things again and again, even though this is in a different cohort. So high blood pressure was associated with slower processing speed. Low vitamin D was associated with slower processing speed. A high HbA1c, so poor blood sugar control. Low folate, low B12, low sleep, and then we also had albumin was important, which is kind of like a marker of particularly protein status and some other aspects of general health. So all those things kind of tell us that sleep, physical activity, and nutrient status are probably some of like these core factors that we could think about when thinking about processing speed that are modifiable. And then on top of that, I think we would consider how are you actually using your brain, and can you train some of the processes that are involved in processing speed. And it seems like that's probably the case, at least in older adults, and it's very likely that that's going to be the same for kids. And I think one potential issue if you've grown up as somebody with slow processing speed, you almost put like a compounding disadvantage because of the way the education system works. It's the same with kids who are dyslexic, for instance. They're expected to perform a certain way in school. These kids are just as smart as everybody else. It's just harder for them to read. But then because of that, they don't get full access to the full set of education and cognitive stimuli that you would get through that education. And in all of the studies that we've done, education is the number one predictor of processing speed in both of those studies that I talked about. And I think that's just because of the importance of overall stimulating the brain, as we talked about ad nauseum on, well, hopefully not ad nauseum because we'll keep talking about it, but that we've talked about extensively on this podcast. And so I think that if you're not getting access to the full scope of education just because you think slightly differently from what might be expected of you within the standard education system, that's going to sort of compound over time. So then finding ways to um, create that stimulus in a way that maps well onto the individual, I think that's going to be um, sort of the primary factor, and then supported by all those other things that I talked about. Um, that's my hypothesis, Josh. Any thoughts or comments to add to that?
Yeah, lots of great stuff there. And yeah, this opens up so many different issues. We could talk about everything we care about. I think with this is one, but we try to constrain it. And yeah, I mean, I was bothered by the fact that in her question, she says we've been told that it can't be increased. I mean,
Yeah, that's
that,
like the worst part of all of it because you
yeah, I
just
mean,
assume that you don't do anything because you assume there's nothing that can be done.
absolutely right. Self-fulfilling prophecy for sure.
Yeah.
There's so many things around cognition and brain health and everything that are completely self-fulfilling because we've been telling these messages for a long time. But clearly, like it's a modifiable, a poor night's sleep is going to tank your processing speed, right?
Mm.
So we know and as you just outlined, many different modifiable factors. So that's one of the things that you would do is to try to look for all of those and optimize them. The charitable way to think about that kind of comment maybe is that if someone's thinking of these processing speed tests as some kind of proxy for, the neural substrates themselves, right? The speed
Hmm.
of transmission and there's probably even more pervasive ideas that you can't do anything about the hardware, right?
Mm.
So but these sorts of tests for processing speed, they're still amalgamating a bunch of different things into that, right?
Yeah.
You're not just getting the ground truth about, the speed of neural transmission. There's a ton
Yeah.
of different stuff going on. So, if you really wanted that, you'd need a test for like, evoked potentials or something like that, where
Yeah.
you're just getting transmission speed. But even there, we know that that's going to be modifiable as well. Those things
Mm.
are going to be responsive. We'd like to know more about the factors that do modify it. But even that would be in that, to the extent that that contributes to the more sort of global processing speed metric, even that itself is modifiable. So I reject the notion wholeheartedly. Uh, and anyways, and all the stuff you talked about would be a lot of things to think about, and just kind of encapsulating it under the model of stimulate and support, where
Yeah.
you want to be stimulating with cognitive activity and cognitive challenge, and in this case, potentially focusing on areas that would help or that involve processing speed, and then ensuring that you're supporting that demand with all the lifestyle factors that you talked about. And I think you could also think about the stimulation side in terms of sort of specific stimulation and broad stimulation. So, the reason we would care about processing speed is because it would manifest in some kind of thing that you're wanting to do. Then it's undermining your potential in some way in some kind
Mm.
of cognitive activity. So there it'd be a matter of what are those things, and then designing particular ways or exercises to work on that specifically, right? Work on the thing that you want to improve on, and if you're assuming in that situation that if performance is not where you wanted it to be, then processing speed is contributing in some way, and working on that thing would be, to me, the place to start. And then you have sort of more broadly distributed ways of stimulating the brain that would help with processing speed. So sort of more complex, novel, real-world skills that you like to do, where processing speed it would make a difference. So, things like playing a sport, certain
Mm.
sports, or a musical instrument, or even certain video games, right? All those things sort of uh, broadly will stimulate broadly, and in that way, we would hypothesize would also create a demand for enhancing processing speed. Um, all that being said, I think that probably these things, for a whole host of reasons, things like processing speed, would probably put too much focus on their contribution
Yeah.
towards someone's cognition, right? I mean, she mentioned it's two bright children. I assume that means they're doing pretty well overall, right?
Yeah.
And like you alluded to, there may have just been certain situations in school that they struggled with, And that gets to the whole question of, well, school's not designed well for a lot of brains, and that's
Yeah.
brain's problem, that's the school's problem, but that's a whole other topic of conversation. Um, but I would say if we're talking about, cognitive performance in general in any particular domain, what's going to account for most of the variance in performance is learning and training rather than processing speed, right?
Mm.
If you have a Formula One driver who has been training for 5 years and has like average processing speed, and you put him up against a novice who's the fastest processor in the world, the one who's trained is going to crush them, right?
Yeah.
So our performance is almost entirely driven by how much we've learned, how much we've trained, how many sub skills we've automated, rather than how fast we process. Processing speed, you might fiddle at the margins of performance by changing that, but that's not going to be the driver. And that applies to any cognitive domain, including motor skills, but also cognitive skills, math, reading, and whatever. So focusing on effective learning, I think, is still going to be the most effective strategy for performing well at the things you care about. Um, and then the processing piece, is kind of helping at the margins. I think that all in all, this also points to the fact that we need more research into these things. I imagine too, you said that maybe also the reason that they were told that nothing can be done is not necessarily that nothing can be done. Rather, we don't have much evidence to base
Yeah.
recommendations on, and that's a fair thing to say,
Mm.
especially when you're trying to cover yourself in a clinic or whatever.
Yeah.
You can't say, "Oh, I can tell you what I might do," but there's not a lot of data that I can say that I can hang my hat on. So that just speaks to the need for more research in this area. And Tommy, I know this woman is local, and I know that we're starting up more efforts in this regard. A Better Brain Fitness lab hosted where you're at the University of Washington. So maybe we could potentially connect up with Annika uh, to see about instituting some of these recommendations with her kids.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea and something we'd love to do. So the kind of the background here is that as some people might know, or hopefully most of you know, we have a Substack. Um, we have a paid version of that Substack. Um, and that if you go into that, you get sort of a few additional things like some ask us anything calls where you can join us and ask us anything like it sounds. Um, and the reason why we did this, often people don't like when sort of content producers like us start asking for money, and it isn't so that we can line our pockets. It's to actually help build a lab where we can start to test some of these ideas and in a more formal research setting. This is called the Better Brain Fitness Lab. It technically started last year with the first little influx of the new sort of paid version of our Substack. It's mainly my office at the University of Washington right now, but we've got set up for cognitive function testing. We've got setups for EEG. We can measure some things like sort of the actual processing speed with evoked potentials. Um, and over time, we'll figure out what are some of the best training approaches for cognitive function, like how much can we enhance cognitive function? What's the effect of improving nutrient status? What's the effect of physical activity? All that kind of stuff. This is obviously a big goal. It may take 5, 10, 20 years, an entire career. But as we build that out, we were thinking that Annika, if you're local, if you're I keep saying kids, but they're young adults. If your children are interested, we would be very happy to try out some of these ideas. You can come to the lab and or do some of it remotely if needed, and just see whether any of this might be beneficial, and we can start to answer some of those questions. Obviously, we're not doing this from a medical or anything standpoint. This is just like two guys who are happy to help and see if there's something we can all learn from that process. But of course, if your children aren't interested, that's fine. And we're still working on building out the lab, and maybe we'll make some of this stuff accessible to other listeners as well. Um, any other thoughts to add to that, Josh?
Yeah, so just to say that, Annika, if you're listening, reach out to us because we don't have your contact
Oh,
information.
yeah.
So you can, if you're, our Substack, by the way, is you can go to betterbrain.fitness. That's where you can register. You can always reply to, you can always leave a comment there or send us a message or reply to an email to reach us. Um, yeah, anything else, Tommy, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I actually wanted to go back to you know talking about some of these differences and what actually matters in terms of how your brain functions. And I'm just going to tell a story about myself, and, like in particular in relation to my wife.
Mhm.
So I think if you were going to look at some aspects of processing speed, particularly when it comes to reading, you compare me and my wife, we are very, very different. Um, we often read the same books. She reads and like internalizes information at probably 3 times the speed that I do. It takes me a lot longer to read. It takes me a lot longer to think about it and just kind of decide, how it all fits into a mental model. Like this could be a novel, but it could also be like scientific information. So, I think I do a pretty good job of integrating information across multiple scales, but it takes me quite a long time to do that. And if you did some kind of formal test of how fast I interpret written information, I'd probably be average or maybe slightly below average. I actually don't know. But I think I do just fine. And obviously, there's a wider range than that. I'm not relating me personally to people who have very slow processing speed that's maybe holding them back in other ways. But I'm just saying that there are individual differences in all of these things, and there are trade-offs, right? A brain that's less good at this thing is better at this thing. And I would again recommend people read the book by my friend Chantal Pratt called The Neuroscience of You, which talks about that, right? Everything is a trade-off. So just because you have slow processing speed doesn't mean that you aren't good at other cognitive functions. And then it's just finding ways to get the best out of that brain for the things that that brain wants to do.
That's a great point. I have to say one more thing then, which that so not only are there trade-offs and with different skills and different brains have different sort of ways in which those trade-offs are happening. We want a diversity of brains, right?
Mm,
We don't want everybody thinking the same way. So whatever might be boosted by the fact that your processing is low on particular test, we may not want to lose that, right? We may
yeah.
not want to boot. So, and one of my biggest issues with how we educate is that we try to create homogeneous brains,
Mm,
and there are a lot of downsides to that. One of which is we likely suppress areas of the brain that would have developed otherwise because of those trade-offs. Whatever you train is what you're going to improve,
mm,
and so you can't be all things at once.
yeah.
Um, and if we want to optimize for collective problem solving, we want as many diverse brains as possible, rather than everybody thinking the same way. So there's also that is a super important consideration that's often lost in the discussion, especially when this is oftentimes oriented around school performance.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's it for this one. If you guys have any questions about this topic or anything else, send it our way. You can go to brainjo.academy/questions. And thanks to Annika for asking this one. And again, reach out to us if you're listening. All right, thanks, Tommy.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye.